Okay, class, this is going to be our video on introductions and conclusions. I like to specifically cover these things in a decent amount of detail because they were something that I struggled with as a student, in particular because my writing professor here at AUM was more of like a Miss Frizzle kind of, oh, we're exploring the world and isn't it beautiful and we're doing all this stuff. And she didn't really get down into like the nuts and bolts of the writing process or the different parts of like an academic essay or anything like that. So I left my composition cycle not really knowing what to do with introductions and conclusions. I just sort of skated by on natural talent because I'm an English major, so I was already inclined for writing, and I can only imagine that if I wasn't, writing papers in subsequent classes would have been a very frustrating experience, as I would have gotten all kinds of negative comments on my introductions and conclusions. Actually, I wouldn't have gotten negative comments on my conclusions because I didn't know what to do in conclusions, so my essays didn't conclude, they just stopped. I just never wrote conclusions for like years. And, I took hits in that in my essays. So I like to stop here in particular because I know this is something that was frustrating for me to deal with as a student, and it certainly wasn't covered in a way that I would have liked it to have been covered. So, we'll start with introductions. So, what are introductions for? Well, they set up some context and some framing for your reader to let them kind of know the kind of thing that your reader is going into. So, for example, if you are writing a compare and contrast paper, sorry, I had a pause there. I had a pretty extensive coughing fit and still feeling sick. So, for example, you might set up the kind of paper you're writing, like a compare and contrast paper. Lets your reader in the introduction know what's being compared and contrasted. You can provide additional context or background information. So maybe if you are telling a story about yourself, you can set up who you were at the beginning of the story. Or you can just sort of talk about the topic that you are going to be discussing with them. If you're making an argument, you can start to flesh out the topic that is being argued about. Now, I will note that a introduction is supposed to be general. That very high level of specific detail that we're generally looking for in academic writing, it doesn't really have its place in the introduction. You can briefly introduce an idea in the introduction, but those specific levels of detail belong in the body of the essay. So don't make your introduction overlong by trying to explain all kinds of specific things in it. It's just supposed to give your reader enough information to know, the topic we're talking about is this. We're going to be talking about it in this way. Either you're making an argument or an analysis or a compare and contrast or whatever it is. And the ultimate point of the paper is this with the thesis statement. So your introduction should end in your thesis statement that is the main point you're trying to make crystal clear to your reader. This is what this essay is about. So there are some different strategies that you might try. I'm going to cover some introduction strategies and conclusion strategies here. There are more than what's listed here, but if you would like a more extensive list, I encourage you to pick up maybe like a used copy of a textbook we used to use called Joining the Conversation. Excellent book. You can find it cheap on Amazon under like the used copies for like a couple bucks often, or if you can find a PDF online. So these come from that, and it's really handy to have a list of like, I don't know what to do in an introduction. What do I do? Well, here are some options for you. So one of the first things you can do is you can simply state your topic. Just tell your reader, I'm telling my reader a story about my first Crohn's disease flare-up. I'm just going to, in my introduction, just be like, hi, here's me. I have Crohn's disease. Discovering that was difficult. Let me tell you the story about my first flare-up. Simple. So all the examples I hear are based on being forced to read Frankenstein. So if I was writing a paper about the first time I had to read Frankenstein and how it changed my life for the worst, my introduction might simply tell my reader that that's the story I'm going to tell, with some background information to set the stage. But again, I'm not looking for like high levels of specificity in an introduction. It's just the introduction. Also, for me, it's the case that if you don't know what else to do with your introduction, this is a fine default position to have. Simply tell your reader what you're going to be telling them about, hit them with your thesis statement, which should be very strong and specific, and then move forward from there. Like one of the things you'll probably hear other people talk about is how you have to, you got to have some pizzazz, you got to hook your reader in, you got to make it interesting for your reader. And that's not really the goal of academic writing. Like if you're writing fiction or poetry, creative nonfiction or something like that, then absolutely think about the best way to hook your reader in. But sometimes in academic writing, what we're trying to do is we're just trying to communicate information as clearly and concisely as possible. So different genres of writing have different goals. Not all of them are to entertain or generate interest. So if you just want to be absolutely straightforward about here's my topic, here's what I'm going to talk about, 100% it's a perfectly serviceable way to start the paper. Is it going to wow me as a reader? Well, no, but I've also read hundreds and hundreds of literacy narratives at this point. Things that students write where there's just like, oh, this will be really interesting. It might well be, but I've probably seen that same really interesting thing a few dozen times already, and it's worn off on me. But that doesn't mean that you didn't write something really interesting. It's just you have to keep your audience in mind. And readers of academic papers, they read all this stuff all the time. So the people who are going to tell you, yeah, you got to have a really good hook. It's like, no, if you're in a fiction class, that's true. But if you are learning to write essays, not necessarily the case. I think there are a lot of people who teach writing who have been teaching it so long, they just forget the nuts and bolts basics that students need and are trying to make it more interesting for themselves when they've been teaching it for 20 years and they're not the student sitting in the classroom for the first time. So that's my little rant about that. I'm very much a crusty old man that's like, let's just teach him how to write and it'll be fine. But if you don't know what else to do, just tell your reader whatever your topic is. Simple, straightforward, good default. You might define a problem in your introduction that then the rest of the essay will give more specifics about that problem and then how you solved it. So in this case, I might talk about how I was assigned to read Frankenstein, a criminally boring book, and the story of the paper is how I managed to get through it, and that's the story I'm going to tell in the specific paper. Here's the problem. I was assigned to read this book. It was boring in the outright. I didn't want to read it, but I had to get through it, so here's what I did. So maybe the problem is you had a difficult thing to do and your literacy helped you out. Maybe the problem you define in your introduction is that you didn't have this literacy because you're learning it for the first time, and the solution to that problem was to learn whatever it is you now know. However you want to frame it is entirely up to you. Defining problems also works for more complicated issues in the world. And it can be useful in an argument paper when you're trying to solve some issue out in the world. Your problem might be like, oh, Alabama politics is too corrupt. That's a problem. Let's define it, let's talk about it, let's try and solve it. And so when you're making arguments for things where it's like, oh, here's a thing that should be changed because there's an issue, this is also a great way to consider starting an essay. You might make a surprising statement. So if you do want to hook your readers in some particular way, saying something shocking and controversial right out of the gate is a way that can really get a reader's attention. So maybe in my hypothetical Frankenstein, I had to read it and it was boring essay. I start my introduction off, first sentence of the essay, I say something like, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein can eat my ass. And that is a very kind of like shocking thing that you wouldn't normally expect to read in an essay. So it immediately grabs the reader's attention. There are caveats to making surprising statements, though. So for the first thing is, it's possible to offend a reader into not wanting to read further. So when you are writing in your classes or for work, you're writing to the particular people you're actually giving your writing to at least a little bit. In college sense, that means every professor's got their own pet peeves, and you're going to have to figure out what those are and adjust your personal writing style in order to adapt to that. If I personally read something, the first line of the essay like this, I'd just be like, oh, this is going to be fun. Let's see where this goes. But there are professors who would say something like, okay, you shouldn't use curse words in an essay. With this first paper, it's a narrative. You're telling me a story about yourself. It's less formal. I would personally be okay with that. The caveat being is don't just put them in your essay to have them in your essay. Use them sparingly and for impact. If you want to start off with a very strong thing like that, I can do that. But you do run the risk of saying something so offensive to your reader if you're trying to shock them that they just put your writing down. Also, it could be the case that the surprising statement you think you're making is not as surprising as you thought it was, depending on your audience. So the example from the original textbook is something like the author of the introduction being like, when I used to play on the playground in third grade, my fellow students would ask me where my family went to church, and I would respond by saying, we don't believe in God. And that, a third grader just declaring that they're an atheist is surprising in some places to conservative Alabamans who heard something like that or read something like that about a child declaring those things. They would be shocked. However, not every country is as religious as the American Bible Belt. So if you went to a place like Sweden, where it's majority atheistic, or China, which is majority atheistic, and you said, we don't believe in God, your audience is going to be like, neither do we, what's the big deal? So that's what I mean by saying it can take some additional finesse. You might offend your reader a bit too much, and then suddenly they're not reading whatever it is you're writing anymore. Or you might say something you think is shocking, and it just falls flat. If you want to experiment with that, if you want to try it out in this class, this class is often a place to try things out, to figure out what works for you. Go nuts. Give it a shot. I'm perfectly fine with that. If it doesn't work out, I'll let you know. But that is one possible way of saying something shocking to get your reader's attention. It can work, but it can also go wrong in ways that, some of these other things don't particularly have the same foibles. Now, you're going to have readers who are like, just stating your topic is boring. That's a them problem. This is more you taking the issue into your own hands, and if there's a mistake, it's possibly on you more than anything else. You might start off in your introduction by asking a question of some kind. Asking a question can get a reader curious and lead them to wanting to read the rest of the paper, because the kind of question you ask in your introduction should only be answerable by reading the rest of the essay. So in my hypothetical introduction about having to read Frankenstein, I might say, I was forced to read this book. It was boring because of this. It was dull because of that. I was frustrated because of this reason. So reader, did Frankenstein turn out to have any redeeming qualities? Well, yes or no in my thesis statement, but that's the rest of the, you'll have to read the rest of the essay to figure out what they are. So the only way to answer this question, like what are the redeeming qualities I thought Frankenstein had, is going to have to be for them to read the rest of the essay. So one of the things about human psychology is we really hate to have unanswered questions. Human brain just doesn't like it at all. So what it tends to do is if we don't have the answer to something, we often will also just make stuff up. But if you give them an unanswered question where it's like, you can have the answer to this, you just got to read further, that will draw your reader into your essay. It will make it so hopefully they go read the rest of whatever it is you've written. Also, side tangent. If you're going to ask questions in your essay, put one in the introduction like this that makes them have to read the rest of it. We'll see that you can also do this in the conclusion to leave the reader with things to think about. My general recommendation for the body of your essay is don't ask questions in it. No questions in the body of your essay. The reason for that is usually when students ask a question in the body of the essay, it's followed immediately by giving the details the reader needs. So if you're, 3 body paragraphs in, you're talking about a very specific thing. You ask a specific question about that specific thing, but the rest of the paragraph's about that stuff. So you just give that information to the reader anyway. It often comes off as like fluffing the word count, and often just kind of wastes the reader's time, because it's like, let me ask you this curious question. Just kidding, here's all the stuff you need to know. So it's not that you can't do it. It's not that you can't use questions to lead from maybe one topic in the body of your essay to another one, or one section of your essay to another one. It's just that at student level writing, it's more likely to go wrong than it is to go right. So my recommendation is don't ask questions in the body of your essay. Just communicate your information, be clear about it. You might lead with a quotation. So there have been a lot of really smart people out there who've said a lot of really smart stuff about any topic you can imagine. If you're going to open with a quote, there are some rules to that. One, cite the quote to make sure the reader knows who said it. Two, the quote should be relevant to the topic you're talking about. There are a lot of... I'm not just going to put a quote at the beginning of my Crohn's disease story from my favorite philosopher because I just happen to really like that philosopher and he said cool stuff. It's like, no, it should be relevant to my story in some way. And if I can't find a quote that's relevant to my story in some way, I shouldn't use it. And then, once you use a quote, whenever you use a quote in an essay, you've brought it into your space like you're in conversation with it. You should respond to it in some way. It shouldn't just be floating up there on its own without you having something to say about it, or you responding to it as if you're in conversation with that author. So, for example, I might open with the quote, "Beware, for I am fearless and therefore powerful," which is said by Frankenstein's monster. For Unit 1, I'm not worried about like works cited and citations and like that, but just so put after the quote who said it. So if I was to type this, I might say, at the big... In Frankenstein's monster at one point says, quotation mark, "Beware, for I am fearless and therefore powerful," end quotation mark. And then the rest of my introduction, I might respond to that by saying, not only is the monster fearless and powerful, but he is also very, very boring. There are some interesting parts, but it takes too long to get to them. So fearless, powerful, and tedious, maybe. But I'm responding to that quote in some way in the rest of my introduction. This is how you're going to be using quotes basically always from here on out in all of your college level writing. In your research paper, if you pull a quote from somewhere, it's because you're about to follow it with your thoughts, your ideas, your response to it. Maybe you think that person who said that is wrong. Maybe they're right. Maybe they said an interesting thing and you're going in a different direction with it. Who knows? But if you use a quote, you respond to it. You take it a little further. You give your own thoughts on it. They say this, I say this. But if you want to start with a quote, you absolutely can. You could draw a contrast. Now, not just in like a compare-contrast paper, but in like a narrative, like what you're writing, it might well be that, you have the events of your story and you were one way before the events of your story, then a bunch of stuff happened, and you're now a different person because of that. You could start off by talking about who you were beforehand. So in my hypothetical Crohn's disease essay, about my first flare-up, I might start off with, before I knew I had Crohn's disease or was going to get Crohn's disease, I used to do all of these things. I used to eat a bunch of raw fruits and vegetables all the time. I used to not really pay attention to my diet. I used to do all this stuff. I used to be able to exercise for hours on end. And then after getting it, I was changed. Or in my Frankenstein example, I used to be cheery and have hope, but then I read Frankenstein and was left a dull, soulless husk of a person because it was such a boring book. So that's one thing that you might consider doing with your introduction if the story you're going to tell involves like a major change in how you saw things or who you are as a person. Use your introduction to set up here's who I used to be. I used to be like this. I used to have a healthy, unbroken body. I used to be able to eat raw fruits and vegetables without pain. That kind of stuff. So that might lend itself to, like, if you don't know what else to do, one, you can always just state your topic. But two, in a narrative sense, in a storytelling sense where you're telling me about a thing that happened to you, keep that in mind. Are you different now because of this story? If so, your introduction might set up who you were before the story happened. And that's basically it for introductions. We're going to rock right along because this is running a bit long. You know what? I'm going to cut this video and we're going to have a separate conclusions video where we start right here. So that way you don't have to do it all in one go because we're already at 20 minutes. So I will see you in the conclusions video where we will wrap up our discussion of introductions and conclusions.